The Broadus family had always dreamed of a home like 657 Boulevard. To Derek and Maria, it was the culmination of years of hard work, saving, and sacrifice, a symbol of everything they had hoped to achieve for their growing family. Nestled in the quiet, picturesque town of Westfield, New Jersey, the house was the epitome of suburban perfection. It was a sprawling colonial-style home with 6 spacious bedrooms, beautiful hardwood floors, and elegant detailing that hinted at its storied past. The front yard was neatly manicured, and tall trees lined the street, offering shade and an air of seclusion. To Derek, this house was more than just a place to live. It was the dream home he and Maria had envisioned when they first got married. For Maria, 657 Boulevard was more than a house. It was a fresh start. Growing up in a working-class family, she had always longed for stability, for a home she could truly call her own. As she walked through the empty halls with Derek during their first visit, she imagined their 3 children running up and down the staircase, playing tag in the backyard, and sitting around the grand dining table during holiday feasts. For the Broadus children, the move meant adventure. They couldn't wait to explore their new bedrooms, discover the nooks and crannies of the spacious attic, and make new friends in the neighborhood. The house wasn't just large. It was alive with history. Built in 1905, it had stood the test of time, witnessing the changes of a century. Derek and Maria saw its age not as a drawback, but as part of its charm. The house felt solid, like it had secrets to tell, a feeling that, at first, was comforting. The neighbors, too, seemed friendly and welcoming. During their initial visits, several stopped by to introduce themselves, offering smiles and kind words. Westfield itself was idyllic, with its small-town vibe, family-owned shops, and excellent schools. It was the perfect place to raise a family, far from the noise and chaos of the city. But there was one thing about the house that stood out, something they hadn't quite noticed at first. On the exterior, just above the front door, was a small plaque that read 657 Boulevard. It was unusual, Derek thought, for a home to display its address so prominently. He chalked it up to a design choice, just another quirk of this old house. After finalizing the purchase, Derek and Maria couldn't wait to move in. They spent days planning how they would arrange the furniture, what colors they would paint the walls, and how they could make the space their own. Derek, especially, felt proud. As a successful businessman, he had worked hard to provide for his family, and this house felt like a reward for years of effort. Their excitement was palpable. On the evening after the closing, Derek decided to stop by the house alone. Maria was home with the kids, and he wanted a moment to soak it all in, to stand in the empty living room and imagine their life there. The sun had just set, casting the house in soft, golden light. Derek parked his car in the driveway and stepped out, inhaling the cool evening air. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so, with only the distant hum of cicadas breaking the silence. As he walked up to the front door, he felt a surge of pride. This is ours now, he thought. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house smelled faintly of wood polish and something else, something older, almost musty. It wasn't unpleasant, just different. Derek wandered through the rooms, picturing where the couch would go, where they might hang family photos, and how they would decorate for the holidays. He spent nearly an hour walking the halls, turning light switches on and off, and imagining the laughter and love that would soon fill the space. Before leaving, Derek decided to check the mailbox. It was a habit. He'd always been the type to stay on top of things. The mailbox was an old-fashioned one, mounted on a post near the front yard. As he opened it, he noticed a single envelope inside. It wasn't unusual to receive mail, so soon after moving in, there were always circulars and welcome notices from local businesses. But this envelope was different. It was plain, with no return address, and simply read, "To the new owners of 657 Boulevard." Curious, Derek opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper neatly folded. The words were typed, not handwritten, and the message began innocuously enough. "Dearest new neighbors at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. Derek smiled. How thoughtful, he thought. But as he read on, his smile faded. 657 Boulevard has been the subject of my family for decades now, and as it approaches its 110th birthday, I've been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father watched in the 1960s. It is now my time. Derek felt a chill run down his spine. Watching, what did that mean? He continued reading, his hands trembling slightly. Do you know the history of 657 Boulevard? Do you know what lies within the walls of this house? Why are you here? I will find out. The letter ended with an ominous sign-off. Welcome, new friends. I am the Watcher. Derek stood frozen, the letter clutched in his hands. The quiet neighborhood around him suddenly felt suffocating. For the first time since stepping foot in 657 Boulevard, he didn't feel like its owner. He felt like its prey. When Derek Broadus returned home that evening, the letter from the Watcher weighed heavily in his pocket. He wasn't entirely sure why it unsettled him so much. Maybe it was the way the words seemed to pulse with an eerie familiarity, as though the author knew him or thought they did. Or perhaps it was the cryptic references to the house itself, 657 Boulevard, spoken of as if it were more than a building. Derek debated whether to share the letter with Maria. On one hand, he didn't want to alarm her, but on the other, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. Over dinner, he slid the letter across the table to her. Maria's smile faltered as she read it. Her fingers tightened around the paper as she reached the part about the history of 657 Boulevard and the ominous phrase, "What lies within the walls?" She glanced up at Derek, her voice trembling. "Is this some kind of joke?" "I don't think so," Derek replied, his voice low. "There's no return address. And look at how personal it is. They know we have kids. They know about the house." That night, Maria couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, her mind racing. She thought about the kids, about the bright future they had imagined in this house, and about the words that seemed to taint that vision. Who writes something like this? She wondered, and why? The following day, Derek and Maria decided to keep the letter to themselves for the time being. They didn't want to alarm the children or draw undue attention from their neighbors. But the unease lingered. Derek found himself glancing over his shoulder more often, scanning the street for anyone watching. The second letter arrived just 3 days later. This time, it was addressed specifically to the Broadus family. Derek retrieved it from the mailbox early in the morning before work. As soon as he opened it, his stomach churned. The tone was no longer welcoming. It was invasive, unnervingly specific. "I see you've already begun making changes to 657 Boulevard. The workers have been busy, and I've been watching them carefully. Have you found what lies in the walls yet? In time, you will." The letter described details that made Derek's blood run cold. The type of car he drove, the way he parked in the driveway, and even the positions of the children as they played in the yard. "I see you have young blood. They are the reason you came, aren't they? Do you think they will be safe here?" That line, "young blood," echoed in Derek's mind like a sinister chant. The writer wasn't just observing. They were studying, dissecting, analyzing their every move. When Maria read the letter, she broke down in tears. "They know about the kids, Derek. They know where we are, what we're doing, how." They called the police that afternoon. An officer arrived, his expression skeptical at first as he examined the letter. But as he read on, his face grew more serious. "This isn't just a prank," he said finally. "Whoever this is, they're watching you. Have you noticed anyone suspicious?" Derek and Maria shook their heads. The neighbors they'd met seemed friendly and ordinary, nothing out of the ordinary. The officer promised to investigate, but offered little reassurance. That night, Derek sat alone in the living room, staring out the front window. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, every shadow under the streetlights taking on a sinister shape. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the unseen eyes boring into him from somewhere he couldn't pinpoint. The next morning, Maria noticed something else odd. One of the contractors working on the house mentioned seeing a man parked in a car across the street for hours. He didn't get out, didn't do anything, the contractor said. Just sat there, watching. Derek felt the hair on his arms stand up. He asked for a description, but it was vague. An older man, average build, nothing remarkable. Whoever it was, they didn't approach, didn't engage, just observed. The third letter came the following week, and this time, it was even more direct. You still haven't found what lies in the walls. Do you think you're safe here? The house belongs to me, and I will not let you ruin it. This letter included an unnerving addition, references to past owners. The Woods family knew when to leave. They understood my connection to this house. But you defy me. The Woods family. Derek and Maria had met them briefly during the sale process. They were a quiet, polite couple who mentioned moving to a retirement community. But now, Derek wondered, had they received letters too? Had they left to escape the Watcher? Derek decided to reach out to the Woods family. Over the phone, Mrs. Woods admitted something that made his blood run cold. They had received one letter, just before they moved out. It had been odd but not threatening, and they dismissed it as a strange coincidence. They hadn't thought to mention it during the sale. For Derek, the pieces of a disturbing puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Whoever the Watcher was, they had been monitoring this house and its inhabitants for years. Maria, meanwhile, grew more anxious by the day. Every noise outside, every shadow on the lawn, every passerby felt like a potential threat. She began closing the curtains, locking doors compulsively, and keeping the children inside more often. The house, which had once felt so full of promise, now felt oppressive. The grandeur of its walls seemed to loom over them, heavy with the weight of the Watcher's words. Derek and Maria were left grappling with an unthinkable reality. Their dream home had become a prison of fear, and the invisible presence of the Watcher was closing in. The days following the third letter from the Watcher were a haze of dread and uncertainty for Derek and Maria Broaddus. The once idyllic dream of 657 Boulevard had crumbled, replaced by an oppressive sense of paranoia. Every creak in the house, every flicker of movement outside, felt like a threat. Maria spent most of her time with the children, trying to shield them from the growing tension. But Derek, driven by frustration and a need to protect his family, was determined to uncover the truth. He spent late nights poring over the letters, looking for patterns or clues that might identify their author. The reference to the house's history haunted him. Do you know what lies within the walls? Derek couldn't dismiss it as metaphorical anymore. What if there was something tangible hidden in the house? Something that tied the Watcher to it? Derek hired a private investigator. The man, a no-nonsense former cop, scoured the neighborhood, looking for any unusual activity or connections. He interviewed neighbors, many of whom seemed genuinely shocked by the situation. But there was one common thread, an eerie fondness for 657 Boulevard. People around here talk about this house like it's alive, the investigator told Derek during a tense phone call. Like it's part of the neighborhood's identity. That's not normal. Meanwhile, Maria's nerves were unraveling. One afternoon, as she prepared lunch in the kitchen, she glanced out the window and froze. A figure stood on the sidewalk, staring at the house. They weren't moving, just standing there, their face obscured by the glare of the sun. Maria's heart pounded as she ducked out of sight, her hands trembling. She reached for her phone to call Derek, but when she looked back, the figure was gone. That night, she told Derek what she'd seen. His face darkened with concern. "We need cameras," he said firmly. Within days, Derek had installed a high-tech security system with cameras covering every angle of the property. He felt a small sense of relief knowing they could monitor the house. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't stop whoever was behind this. The fourth letter arrived soon after. This time, it was shorter but no less chilling. "Your cameras won't help you. I see everything. You cannot stop me. Derek felt a wave of fury rise within him. He was done feeling helpless, done being terrorized by someone who seemed to revel in their anonymity. He shared the latest letter with the investigator, who urged him to revisit the house's history. Together, they dug into public records and discovered unsettling details about the property. Over the decades, 657 Boulevard had changed hands numerous times, but several previous owners had abruptly left without explanation. There were whispers of financial troubles, sudden illnesses, and family disputes. Nothing concrete, but enough to paint a pattern of unease. Then, there was the Watchers' claim that their family had been monitoring the house for generations. While there was no way to verify this directly, the investigator noted that Westfield was an old community with deep roots. It wasn't uncommon for families to stay in the same area for decades. The most disturbing find came from an old news clipping. Decades earlier, a young child who had lived in the house vanished under mysterious circumstances. The case had never been solved, and though there was no mention of the Watcher, Derek couldn't help but feel a connection. Was that what lay within the walls? The thought gnawed at him until he couldn't resist any longer. One night, after the children were asleep, Derek took a flashlight and a crowbar and began inspecting the house's walls. Maria, reluctant but equally desperate for answers, joined him. Together, they pried open sections of drywall in the basement, attic, and even behind the ornate paneling in the living room. But they found nothing. No hidden rooms, no cryptic messages, no remains. It should have been a relief, but it wasn't. The absence of answers only deepened the mystery. Then came the breaking point. One evening, as the family sat down for dinner, there was a knock at the door. Derek tensed, his mind racing. He glanced at Maria, who nodded nervously. When he opened the door, no one was there. Just an envelope sitting on the doormat. This letter was different. It wasn't addressed to the family. It was addressed to the children. Your parents don't understand, but you will. 657 Boulevard is waiting for you. Be patient. Derek and Maria didn't sleep that night. They sat together at the kitchen table, the letter between them. Maria's face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a mug of tea. "We can't stay here," she whispered. "Not anymore." Derek wanted to argue, to tell her they could fight this, but he knew she was right. The Watcher wasn't going to stop, and every moment they stayed put their children at risk. The next day, they began making arrangements to move out. It wasn't easy. After pouring their savings into the house, they couldn't afford to abandon it outright. They decided to rent it out instead, hoping to recoup some of their losses. But as they packed, the weight of their decision lingered. 657 Boulevard had been their dream, and now it was a nightmare they couldn't wake from. On their last night in the house, Maria stood at the front window, staring out at the street. She thought she saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trees, but when she blinked, it was gone. The house was quiet, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. The Broadest family moved out of 657 Boulevard under the cover of night, leaving behind their dream home and taking only what they could carry. The house loomed in the rearview mirror as Derek drove away, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Maria sat in silence beside him, clutching their youngest child tightly, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. But leaving the house didn't mean leaving the fear behind. The specter of the Watcher followed them, not physically, but emotionally, embedding itself in their every thought. The unanswered questions about 657 Boulevard became an obsession for Derek. Who was behind the letters? Why had they been targeted? In the weeks following their departure, Derek and Maria worked to rent out the house. The task proved harder than they had imagined. Word about the Watcher had spread through the neighborhood, whispered in hushed tones at community events and local shops. Prospective renters would tour the house, their eyes lingering on the grand staircase and the spacious backyard. But they always left with vague excuses. The stigma of the letters hung over the property like a dark cloud. Derek felt it every time he stepped through the front door to show the house. It wasn't just a home anymore. It was a cautionary tale, a local legend that people spoke of with a mix of fear and fascination. One evening, Derek sat alone at the dining table in their temporary rental. Before him were the letters, spread out like pieces of a puzzle. He read them again and again, searching for clues he might have missed. I see everything, what lies within the walls. Young blood, the phrases taunted him, their meaning slippery and elusive. He had contacted every authority he could think of, the police, private investigators, even a forensic linguist, but none had been able to crack the case. The writer had been careful, leaving no fingerprints, no identifying markers. For Maria, the letters were a wound she wanted to forget. "Let it go, Derek," she said one night, her voice tired. "We have to move on, for the kids." But Derek couldn't move on. Every fiber of his being screamed that there was more to this story, that somewhere, someone knew the truth. The breakthrough, or so Derek thought, came months later. He received a call from the private investigator, who had uncovered something unusual in the neighborhood records. Several families living on the same block had been there for decades, their properties passed down through generations. One name stood out, the Langfords. Their house was directly adjacent to 657 Boulevard, its windows offering a clear view of the broadest property. The family was known for being reclusive, especially Michael Langford, an eccentric middle-aged man who rarely left the house. The investigators suspected Michael might be the watcher. His age fit with the letter's claims of a long-standing connection to the house, and his behavior was odd enough to raise red flags. Derek felt a flicker of hope. If they could prove Michael was behind the letters, they could reclaim some sense of safety. But when the police questioned Michael, he denied everything. There was no evidence tying him to the letters, and without proof, they couldn't pursue him further. Derek's hope dimmed, replaced by frustration. What if it wasn't him? He thought, what if the watcher was someone else entirely? Meanwhile, Maria tried to create a semblance of normalcy for the kids. She enrolled them in new schools and avoided talking about the house as much as possible. But the fear lingered. At night, when the house was quiet, Maria would lie awake, replaying the events in her mind. She'd wonder if they had done the right thing by leaving, or if the watcher would find them again. Then, another letter arrived. This one wasn't addressed to Derek and Maria. It was addressed to the new renters they had finally secured for 657 Boulevard. The renters had moved in reluctantly, lured by a reduced rent and reassurances from Derek and Maria that the letters had stopped. But within weeks, they too became targets. The letter was brief but chilling. "I see the changes you've made to my home. You think you are safe there, but you are not. 657 Boulevard is mine, and I will always be watching." When the renters contacted Derek about the letter, his heart sank. He apologized profusely, offered to let them out of their lease, and even considered lowering the rent further. But the renters stayed for now, citing financial constraints. The arrival of the new letter reignited Derek's obsession. He began visiting the neighborhood under the guise of checking on the house, parking down the street and watching from a distance. He scanned the faces of neighbors, looking for anything suspicious, a lingering glance, a knowing smile, but found nothing. The mystery of the watcher remained unsolved, and over time, Derek and Maria began to accept that it might always be that way. 657 Boulevard became a ghost to them, a presence they couldn't shake but refused to confront directly. They stopped visiting, stopped answering calls about the house unless absolutely necessary. Years passed, and the story of the watcher faded from public memory, replaced by new scandals, new fears. But for Derek and Maria, it never truly ended. Even now, late at night, Derek sometimes dreams of 657 Boulevard. In his dreams, the house is alive, its walls breathing, its windows watching. And in every dream, he hears the same words, whispered from the shadows. "I see everything." The broadest family moved on, but the mystery of the watcher remained, an open wound in their lives and a chilling reminder that some questions are better left unanswered. In the quiet town of Westfield, New Jersey, 657 Boulevard was a house like any other, at least on the surface. The house, a beautiful colonial-style property, sat nestled among tree-lined streets in a charming neighborhood. Its facade gleamed with freshly painted trim, and its lush yard was carefully manicured, radiating the kind of idyllic suburban peace that anyone would envy. But beneath the well-maintained exterior, there were secrets that had been buried in the house's past long before the Broadus family arrived. The previous owners of 657 Boulevard, the Woods family, had lived there for more than 20 years. To outsiders, they were a picture-perfect family. Steve and Carol Woods, with their 2 children, living a life of normalcy. But as the years wore on, something began to shift within the house. It started with small things that could easily be dismissed: creaky floorboards, doors that wouldn't close properly, or the occasional whisper in the hallways late at night. At first, the Woods family chalked these occurrences up to the house's age, a normal part of living in an old home. But as time went on, the disturbances grew more unsettling, more intrusive. In the early days, Steve would often find objects in their home moved, as though someone had come in when they weren't looking. It was always subtle. Books slightly shifted on shelves, a chair placed askew, but enough to unsettle him. He joked about it to Carol, calling it house quirks, but there was an unease in his voice that Carol couldn't ignore. She, too, began noticing things. Clothes gone missing, faucets that would suddenly be turned on, and strange scraping noises coming from the walls at night. The sounds were soft at first, like scratching or scurrying, but they grew louder, as though someone was trying to get through. When Carol mentioned it to her friends, they laughed it off, calling it a touch of the spooky. But Carol didn't laugh. She didn't even think it was possible to laugh when the sensation of being watched was so pervasive in her home. The breaking point came when their youngest child, a 7-year-old boy named Dylan, began complaining about a man who would come into his room at night. He described a tall, shadowy figure with a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat that seemed to blend into the darkness of his room. Dylan would often wake in the middle of the night, crying, insisting that the man was standing in the doorway, watching him sleep. At first, Steve and Carol thought it was a product of their son's imagination, maybe a bad dream, a fleeting fear. But it continued. Dylan became increasingly terrified of his room, even refusing to go to bed unless one of his parents stayed with him. The stories about the man started to evolve. Dylan's accounts became more detailed. The figure no longer stood by the door. Now, it walked around the room, sitting at the edge of his bed, staring down at him with eyes that glowed in the dark. Carol and Steve tried to console their son, telling him it was nothing but a nightmare. But their own sense of unease was growing. What began as a child's fear soon became a family-wide concern. There were nights when the family would all hear the sound of footsteps above them, pacing back and forth, though no one was upstairs. At other times, they would hear a low murmur, like distant voices echoing through the walls. But when Steve would investigate, there would be nothing there. He even checked the attic, where he believed the sounds might be coming from, but it was always empty. Despite the escalating oddities, the Woods family did their best to carry on with their daily lives. Carol and Steve continued to work, and the children attended school. But the constant tension of living in a house that seemed to pulse with an invisible energy began to take its toll. Carol found herself becoming more anxious, more irritable, and Steve started drinking more, finding solace in alcohol to cope with the growing pressure. Eventually, Carol couldn't ignore the creeping fear that the house itself was alive with something dark, something vengeful. But what could they do? They had put down roots in the town, raised their children there, and had no reason to believe anything could be wrong with the house. The breaking point came when Carol found a letter in the mailbox, an anonymous letter, with no return address, that seemed to eerily echo Dylan's descriptions of the man. The letter read, "I see you. I know what you are doing. I've always been watching. This house is mine, and soon you will leave. All of you." It was simple, chilling, and more than enough to send the Woods family into a panic. The handwriting was rough, uneven, almost as though it had been written in a frenzy. It was addressed to no one in particular, just a general warning to the family. Carol's first instinct was to call the police, but there was nothing they could do. No crime had been committed, no physical evidence to tie anyone to the letter. Just a vague threat, one that felt all too real. Dylan's terror grew, and so did the disturbances in the house. Carol and Steve became convinced that the house had a malevolent presence, something far older and more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. Soon, it was clear they couldn't stay. Carol and Steve made the gut-wrenching decision to sell the house. But even that wasn't easy. It took months for the Woods family to finally find a buyer. A family that was unaware of the history, unaware of the strange occurrences that plagued the home. Once the house was sold, the Woods family left Westfield. They moved far away, hoping to escape the haunted memories that clung to 657 Boulevard. But even after they moved, the eerie sense of being watched never truly left them. Carol and Steve often spoke of the strange occurrences they had experienced, but both would avoid talking about the house in any detail. They had sold their story, but the price was far higher than they had ever anticipated. And so, the house sat empty for a time before the Broaddus family arrived. Unbeknownst to them, the house's dark past would soon catch up with them. The Woods family's warning was still out there, carried on the wind, and soon, the Broaddus family would find themselves caught in the same web of fear and mystery that had driven the Woods family away. As the Broaddus family settled into 657 Boulevard, they were blissfully unaware of the house's unsettling past. Their excitement about moving into a dream home quickly faded as they started receiving the cryptic letters from the Watcher. But unbeknownst to them, the house had a history of its own, one that was darker, more sinister than they could have ever imagined. The more Derek dug into the house's past, the more questions he uncovered. His initial suspicions about the neighborhood were brief and fleeting, but soon, as his obsession with the letters grew, Derek became fixated on uncovering everything about 657 Boulevard. There was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind, a sense that the house had always been more than just a house. It had been waiting for someone to arrive. But why? And who, or what, was the force that had haunted the home for so many years? Derek's obsession with the house's history reached a fever pitch. Every time he found a new piece of information, it only led to more questions. He was becoming consumed by the house's secrets, and it wasn't just the letters anymore. The unease had seeped into every aspect of his life. He began seeing shadows out of the corner of his eye, hearing strange noises when he was alone. His mind played tricks on him, but deep down he knew that it wasn't just his imagination. One evening, after weeks of research, Derek was poring over old photographs of the house's previous owners. He had uncovered something troubling. In nearly every photograph, 657 Boulevard appeared to loom ominously in the background. The house looked as though it was watching them, just as it had watched the Broaddus family, just as it had watched every family before them. The air felt heavier in the room as he stared at the images. He could feel it again, the suffocating presence of the house, creeping up on him. That night, after dinner, Derek and Maria decided to take a walk around the property. They had been avoiding the house's overgrown backyard for months, but tonight, something urged Derek to confront the house directly. He felt that whatever was haunting the house might be closer than he realized, hiding in the shadows just beyond the backyard. They stepped outside into the cool night air, the moon casting an eerie glow on the aging facade of 657 Boulevard. As they made their way to the back, Derek's eyes darted to the large, ornate windows that lined the second story. The house had always felt imposing, but tonight, something was different. The windows seemed darker than usual, almost as if they were reflecting the night itself, swallowing up the light. Maria reached for Derek's hand, sensing his unease. "Do you feel it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Derek nodded, his throat dry. He had never told Maria about the strange visions he'd been having. The fleeting shadows, the whispering voices. He couldn't explain it, but he knew she was feeling it too. There was something alive in the house, something ancient and full of malice. As they reached the back of the property, Derek stopped dead in his tracks. In the dim light of the backyard, something was barely visible, something that shouldn't have been there. It was a small structure, almost hidden behind the thick trees and ivy that had grown wild over the years. Derek had never noticed it before. It was a shed, no, more like a small cabin or an outbuilding. He squinted in the dim light, trying to make sense of it. "Did you know this was here?" Derek asked Maria, his voice low. Maria shook her head. "No, I've never seen it before." A sense of dread washed over Derek as he approached the structure. The air around him seemed to grow colder, and the shadows cast by the trees seemed to lengthen, reaching out toward him like fingers. He reached for the rusted door handle, which creaked ominously as he turned it. The door swung open with a sickening groan, revealing only darkness within. Derek hesitated for a moment, but his curiosity got the better of him. He stepped inside, the air growing colder still as he crossed the threshold. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath visible in the freezing air. As he took another step, the floorboards creaked beneath his feet. Suddenly, something shifted in the dark. Derek froze, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. His pulse quickened as his gaze fell upon the walls. They were covered with old, yellowed newspaper clippings, articles from years past. His breath caught in his throat as he saw the familiar headlines. "Family disappears from 657 Boulevard." One headline read. "Neighbors report strange noises from house on Boulevard." Another headline proclaimed. The articles described strange occurrences that had plagued the house's residents for years, eerily similar to what the Broaddus family had experienced. The house had a history of terror, each owner reporting unexplained noises, shadowy figures, and the feeling of being watched. But the most disturbing article of all was one that described a missing family, a family that had lived in 657 Boulevard in the early 1900s. They had vanished without a trace, and no one had ever been able to explain what happened to them. Derek's mind raced. The house had been a source of terror for years, decades, even. But why? Was it the Watcher who had been tormenting the families? Or was there something darker, something older, behind the events? Derek felt a wave of nausea wash over him. He had come too far to turn back now. The truth was right in front of him, and yet he was terrified of what he might find next. As he continued to explore the small cabin, something caught his eye. On the far wall, partially hidden behind a stack of old boxes, was a small wooden door. It was so inconspicuous that Derek almost missed it. The door was barely the size of a closet, but it seemed to beckon him. The curiosity that had brought him this far now clawed at him, urging him to open it. He approached the door slowly, his hand trembling as he reached for the knob. With a click, the door opened, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into complete darkness. Derek's pulse raced, his instincts telling him to turn back, but he ignored them. He had to know what was hidden beneath the house, something that had been waiting all this time to be discovered. The stairs creaked beneath his weight as he descended. The darkness seemed to close in around him, and the temperature dropped even further. He could barely breathe as the air grew thick with something he couldn't explain, a palpable presence that seemed to surround him, pressing in on him from all sides. At the bottom of the stairs, Derek's flashlight flickered, casting an eerie glow across the room. And then he saw it. On the walls were more newspaper clippings, photos, and, most disturbingly, hundreds of letters that had been written over the years, each one from the Watcher. These letters had never been sent, only collected and stored in the hidden room beneath the house, where no one could find them. Derek's hand shook as he picked one up. It was the same handwriting, the same chilling messages that had tormented him and his family for months. The truth was clear now. The house, the letters, the Watcher, it was all connected. But the most terrifying realization of all was that the house itself wasn't just haunted by a spirit. It was haunted by the Watcher, who had been waiting for the right family to move in. And as Derek stared at the hundreds of unsent letters, He knew that he and his family were just the latest victims of the house's dark history. As Derek stood in the hidden room, his flashlight illuminating the countless letters, he could almost hear the whispers in the darkness. The Watcher was still there, and it wasn't going away. Derek's discovery in the hidden room of 657 Boulevard was the most chilling moment of his investigation into the house's dark past. Yet, the true horror had only just begun. As Derek stared at the piles of unsent letters, each one from the Watcher, he couldn't shake the feeling that these letters weren't just reminders of the past. They were an ongoing invitation. The Watcher was still out there, watching, waiting for the next family to arrive. And now, it seemed the Broadus family had been chosen. Derek and Maria had become obsessed with the house's history, but it was becoming clear that no one was ever meant to escape the pull of 657 Boulevard. The house was a creature of its own, a malevolent entity that fed on fear and despair. And as Derek would soon learn, it didn't just torment its victims from the shadows. It had the power to slowly consume them from the inside out. After his discovery in the basement, Derek felt a growing unease that he couldn't explain. He'd been trying to warn his family, to prepare them for what was coming. But the weight of the house's secrets had become too much for him to bear. The walls of 657 Boulevard seemed to close in on him, the very air in the house thick with dread. Derek had spent nights awake, his mind racing with terrifying thoughts. What if the Watcher wasn't just a person, but a force? What if the house itself had been built as a trap that snared everyone who entered? The more Derek uncovered, the more his paranoia grew. He started noticing strange occurrences in the house that had never seemed out of place before. The floorboards creaked louder at night, as though someone or something was walking through the hallways. The windows, once bathed in sunlight, now seemed shrouded in an unnatural gloom, no matter the time of day. And the letters, dozens of them, kept appearing, no matter how many times Derek destroyed them. Maria noticed the changes in Derek. His eyes were hollow, his once bright demeanor now replaced by a constant, gnawing anxiety. She begged him to stop, to move on, to let the house go. But Derek couldn't. He couldn't walk away from what he had uncovered. The house was feeding on him, just as it had fed on the other families before them. One evening, as they sat in the dimly lit living room, Derek found another letter. It had arrived that day, slipped under the door while they were out. But this one was different. Unlike the others, this letter wasn't addressed to them. Instead, it was addressed to someone who had been dead for decades, someone who had lived in the house long before the Broadus family had ever stepped foot in it. The name on the letter was Franklin Woods, the patriarch of the Woods family, the family who had owned 657 Boulevard before the Broadus family had moved in. The letter was chilling. It spoke of the Watcher's presence in the house long before the Broadus family ever arrived. The Watcher had been watching Franklin Woods, even when the house was still new. The letter claimed that the house was cursed, that anyone who lived there would be driven mad by its power, forced to confront the very darkness that had been sown into its foundations. The Watcher didn't just torment. It ensured that its victims could never leave. Maria shuddered as Derek read the letter aloud. He couldn't stop himself from shaking as he realized that the curse wasn't just about the Broadus family. It was about the house itself. The Watcher had been following the Woods family, too. And when the Woods family had sold the house, they had been forced to leave their past behind, carrying with them the dark weight of the house's curse. But the letter didn't stop there. It also revealed something far more sinister, a warning. "You will never escape. I am always watching," it read. "And when you finally give in, when you can no longer fight the darkness, the house will claim you. I will claim you. It will be too late." Derek felt the walls of the house closing in. The tension had reached its peak. He was no longer certain whether he was losing his mind or if the house was truly alive, manipulating him, controlling his every thought. His every decision felt as if it was being guided by some unseen force. It was no longer about the letters. It was about the house itself. It was as if 657 Boulevard had a will of its own, its own hunger, its own dark desire to claim the souls of anyone who dared to call it home. Maria, too, was feeling the effects. She had always been the stronger one, the one who tried to keep the family together, but she was now becoming just as consumed by the house's presence. She would wake in the middle of the night, covered in sweat, convinced that someone was in the house, standing over her, watching. She would hear whispers in the walls, faint voices calling her name, but when she checked, there was no one there. The fear had crept into her bones, and she could no longer escape it. Their children, too, had been affected. The once cheerful sounds of laughter that had filled the house were now replaced by the unsettling silence of dread. Their son, Michael, had begun talking about a man who visited him in his dreams. A man with dark eyes who whispered secrets about the house. The man never showed his face, but Michael knew he was always there, lurking in the shadows, just waiting for the right moment to strike. One night, as Derek and Maria sat in the living room, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway outside. The floorboards creaked with each step, growing louder as they drew nearer. The door to the living room creaked open, and there, standing in the doorway, was the figure of a man, a tall, thin figure, wearing a tattered coat, his face hidden in shadow. Derek's heart stopped. He knew who it was. It was the Watcher. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching them, waiting for them to make the first move. Derek could feel the weight of the house bearing down on him, could feel the pressure building in his chest. His mind screamed for him to run, to escape, but his body was frozen, unable to move. Then, in the blink of an eye, the figure vanished. The door slammed shut, the footsteps ceased, and the house fell silent once more. The Broaddus family knew in that moment that they would never be free of 657 Boulevard. The Watcher wasn't just a man or a ghost. It was a force, a dark entity tied to the house itself, and it wasn't going to let them leave. It had watched over this house for decades, and it had claimed every family that had ever dared to call it home. The Broaddus family moved out shortly after that night, unable to take the psychological toll any longer. But their story doesn't end there. The house still stands, still waiting, still watching. And those who pass by may still hear whispers carried on the wind, as if the house itself is trying to tell its dark secrets to those who dare to listen. No one knows exactly what happened to the Broaddus family after they left, but one thing is certain. The curse of 657 Boulevard never ends. The year was 2014, and the Broaddus family had already experienced what seemed like an eternity of terror. They had moved into their dream home at 657 Boulevard in Westfield, New Jersey, full of hope and excitement. The house, an imposing structure with grand windows and an old-world charm, promised the fresh start they had longed for. But that dream quickly descended into a waking nightmare when they received the first letter. They thought it was just a prank at first, some twisted joke from a neighbor who had been too bored and far too cruel. But as the letters continued to arrive, each more chilling than the last, their excitement turned to dread. The Watcher, as the writer called themselves, claimed to have been observing them for years, watching their every move. No detail about their daily life was too insignificant, no room in their house too private. The letters grew increasingly personal, invasive, and ominous. The sense of being stalked, hunted, had settled into their home like an uninvited guest that refused to leave. As days passed into weeks, the Broaddus family's fear began to consume them. What was once a hopeful, joyous beginning now felt like a sinister trap from which there was no escape. It wasn't just the letters anymore. It was the fear, the constant unease that gnawed at them, made them question their own safety, and forced them to wonder if they were ever truly alone. They reached out to everyone they could think of, neighbors, the police, and even private investigators, hoping for some kind of answer, some clue as to who could be behind the letters. But as the investigation dragged on, they quickly realized they were facing a mystery much darker than they could have imagined. From the very first letter, the Broaddus family had been thrown into an emotional and psychological upheaval. Derek Broaddus, the father, tried to hold it together for his family, but the relentless tension began to take a toll. He couldn't shake the image of the letter's words. "I've been watching you for years. How could anyone know such intimate details about their family? How could someone be so close, yet so elusive?" Derek had always been a rational man. He wanted to believe it was just a prank, some sick, twisted joke played by an angry neighbor or someone who thought it would be fun to terrorize a new family. But when the second letter arrived, with more specific details about their lives and the house itself, the horror sunk in. It was no longer a game. It was a real threat. His wife, Maria, was equally shaken, but for her, the fear came from the sense of being completely powerless. She would lie awake at night, her eyes scanning every corner of their new home, her ears straining for the faintest sound. Was someone outside their window, watching them as they slept? It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, as if the house had become its own living, breathing thing, one that held dark secrets it was unwilling to share. The couple knew they had to take action, but the question remained. Who could they turn to for help? The first step the Broaddus family took was to reach out to their neighbors. They went door to door, knocking on every house near 657 Boulevard, hoping that someone would have noticed something suspicious or heard anything out of the ordinary. But the responses were always the same: blank stares, polite refusals, and nervous laughter. No one had seen or heard anything unusual. Most people dismissed it as an odd prank, and some even seemed uncomfortable with the Broaddus family's inquiries. But one neighbor, an older couple who had lived on the block for decades, seemed to take the letters more seriously. They were the only ones who didn't brush off the Broaddus concerns with a laugh or an eye roll. The couple explained that the neighborhood had always been peaceful, quiet even. People minded their own business, and everyone looked out for each other. But they also mentioned that 657 Boulevard was known as a house that had bad energy. They didn't know the details, but the vague words were enough to set off alarm bells in the Broaddus family's minds. At this point, Derek and Maria realized they couldn't handle this alone. They needed help. The next step was contacting the local police. They hoped that law enforcement might be able to track down the person behind the letters, but the response was not what they had hoped for. The police were sympathetic, but ultimately unable to do much. There was no physical evidence, no fingerprints, no clear suspects. The letters were just vague enough to not be considered threats, and there was no obvious crime to investigate. The police offered some advice, mostly regarding home security, but there was no indication that the letters would stop. In desperation, the Broaddus family turned to a private investigator. This was their last hope. The investigators they hired were professional and diligent, but they, too, were faced with dead ends. The letters continued to come, each one more cryptic than the last, but there was still no way to trace the source. No one could figure out how the writer knew so much about them. One investigator discovered that there was a history of strange occurrences in the house, even before the Broaddus family moved in. The previous owners, the Woods family, had also received disturbing letters, though they had left without ever figuring out who was behind them. The connection between the Woods family and the Broaddus family was chilling. Both families were being stalked by the same person, perhaps even the same force. But the question remained, why? Why 657 Boulevard? Why them? With every day that passed, the tension grew. Every knock at the door, every creak of the floorboards, every sound in the night made them question whether they were being watched. And yet, despite their efforts, the watcher remained an enigma. As weeks turned into months, the psychological toll on the Broaddus family grew unbearable. Derek began to lose sleep, his mind consumed by the idea that someone was always watching. His once logical, calm demeanor started to crack under the pressure. Maria, too, was falling apart. She would check the windows obsessively, always expecting to see the silhouette of a person standing outside. Their children, Ethan and Lily, were also affected, their innocence tainted by the fear that hung in the air. The weight of the letters was no longer just emotional. It was physical. It felt like the house was closing in on them, like the walls themselves were closing around their throats, suffocating them slowly. But the more the family tried to push back, the more the Watcher seemed to escalate the fear. It was as though the Watcher was not just observing them, but enjoying their fear, savoring it, and finding new ways to make them feel vulnerable. And as the Broaddus family reached out to more people, more investigators, more authorities, they found themselves at the mercy of a force they couldn't understand, let alone fight. Would the Watcher ever stop? Or had the Broaddus family unknowingly become part of something much darker, something that had been waiting in the shadows of 657 Boulevard for years? The Broaddus family's nightmare continued to spiral out of control. The once beautiful house they had dreamed of raising their family in was now a source of constant dread. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind through the trees, every distant knock seemed to carry with it the unshakable feeling of being watched. It was one cold autumn evening when Derek Broaddus saw something that would forever alter the course of the family's terror. As he sat in the living room, the house quiet, save for the occasional sound of his wife Maria shuffling around in the kitchen and their children playing upstairs, Derek's mind wandered back to the horrifying letters from the Watcher. The mysterious writer had claimed to be keeping an eye on the family, watching their every move from the shadows, lurking just out of sight. Derek had always been a skeptical man, and even as the letters grew more menacing, he couldn't help but wonder if it was all just a cruel hoax. But that night, as he glanced out the window, something caught his eye, something that didn't fit. A shadow, moving slowly, deliberately, across the lawn. It was dark, indistinct, but unmistakably there. At first, Derek thought it might be a trick of the light, a passing car's headlights casting strange patterns on the trees or the bushes. But then it moved again. The shadow wasn't like a shadow should be. It didn't fade or shift with the angle of the light. It stayed solid, purposeful. And as it moved past the front windows, Derek's heart skipped a beat. This was no accident. This was a person. The figure paused just outside the front porch, as if it knew exactly where Derek would be looking. Derek's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The figure was tall and indistinct, cloaked in dark clothing, their features hidden by the shadows. There was no mistaking it now. Someone was out there, watching them. The Watcher was real. The following days passed in a haze of anxiety. Derek couldn't shake the image of the shadowy figure outside their home. His mind raced, each thought a frantic whirl of questions. Who was it? Was it the Watcher, or was it just some random person lurking near their house? Could they have been spotted by someone passing by? Or was this something more sinister? Derek couldn't sleep. Every night, he lay awake, his heart pounding in his chest as he listened for sounds that might indicate someone was sneaking around the property. Each creak of the house felt like it was echoing in the silence. Each gust of wind seemed louder, more ominous. It wasn't long before the terror of it all began to overwhelm him. He felt trapped, as though he were a prisoner in his own home. But worse still was the thought that no one could help. The police had already told him they couldn't do anything without concrete evidence. And even the private investigators had come up with nothing. The Watcher was as elusive as ever, lurking in the shadows, just beyond their reach. Driven by desperation, Derek decided to take matters into his own hands. If the police wouldn't investigate further, and if the private detectives were hitting dead ends, he would stake out the house himself. It was a reckless idea, one born out of fear and frustration, but it seemed like the only way he might be able to get answers. On a chilly October night, Derek made his decision. He would stay up and watch the house, waiting for any sign of the figure he had seen in the yard. Maria and the kids were asleep, unaware of the growing obsession taking root inside him. He told them he was going to take care of some work in the garage, but the truth was much darker. He had to know. He couldn't rest until he knew who was watching them and why. He sat quietly in the darkness, his eyes trained on the front windows, the back door, and the perimeter of the property. The house was silent. No sounds except for the occasional rustling of the trees and the wind. Derek's breathing grew shallow as the minutes turned to hours. the dread hanging over him like a thick fog. Was it all in his head? Was he just imagining things, seeing things that weren't there? Or was the watcher really out there, waiting for the right moment to strike? Suddenly, there was movement, a slight rustle near the edge of the driveway. Derek's heart stopped. He wasn't imagining it this time. He saw it again, the same shadowy figure, moving cautiously along the side of the property, staying close to the fence that ran along the yard. Derek felt his pulse race as he leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the workbench for stability. He hadn't been this scared in his life. The figure moved with purpose, not hurried but deliberate. It was as if the person knew exactly where to go, where to hide, how to stay just out of sight. Derek's stomach churned. There was no doubt now. The watcher was here, in their neighborhood, in their yard. Derek reached for his phone, trying to stay as quiet as possible, his mind scrambling to think clearly. Should he call the police again? Would they even come? He knew the answer before he dialed the number. Nothing would change. There was no evidence. They were all trapped in this terrifying game with no way to win. Over the next few days, Derek's obsession with the watcher only grew. He couldn't stop thinking about the shadow he had seen outside. Every time he stepped into the yard, he felt as if someone was there, watching him from the darkness. He would scan the trees, the bushes, the garage, anything that could conceal a hidden figure. It didn't help that the letters had stopped for a while after the last one, as if the watcher was taking a break, or maybe waiting to see if Derek would crack under the pressure. The silence was more suffocating than the letters had been. It was as if the watcher was playing a game with them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. Derek had no way of knowing whether the figure he had seen was an isolated incident or just the beginning of something far worse. He began spending more and more time outside, keeping a constant watch over the property. His work, his relationships, even his health began to suffer as he poured every ounce of energy into this mission. Maria noticed the change in him. She had seen Derek go from a loving father and husband to a man consumed by paranoia and fear. She tried to talk to him, to reason with him, but every time the conversation came up, Derek would brush her off with the same excuse. I need to know who is out there. I need to make sure we're safe. And so, the Broadus family's descent into fear continued. Derek's nightly vigils only deepened the sense of dread that had settled over their home. They were no longer just waiting for the watcher to strike. Now, they were waiting for the next letter, the next sign, the next movement in the darkness that would make them feel truly alive. The question lingered. What would Derek discover next? And would they ever find peace in their home again? The stakes had never been higher for the Broadus family. The sighting of the shadowy figure outside their home sent Derek into a spiral of paranoia and desperation. While Maria tried to shield the children from the growing chaos, Derek was consumed by one thought. Who was the watcher, and what did they want? Determined to uncover the truth, Derek turned their home into a fortress of vigilance. He installed high-tech surveillance cameras on every corner of the house, motion-activated lights along the yard, and alarms on all the windows and doors. Yet, despite all these precautions, there was no sign of the shadowy figure returning. The silence was deafening, and it only deepened Derek's unease. Was the watcher waiting for something, or someone? It was a stormy night in November when everything came to a head. Derek, unable to sleep, sat in his darkened study, flipping through the letters they had received. Each word seemed to taunt him. Who am I? I am the watcher. Do you know what lies beneath the floors of 657 Boulevard? Have they found what I left behind? Derek's frustration boiled over. He slammed the letters onto the desk and stared out the window into the rain-soaked yard. For weeks, the cameras had recorded nothing out of the ordinary, just squirrels, stray cats, and the occasional jogger. But tonight felt different. Lightning flashed, illuminating the backyard for a brief second, and Derek thought he saw something move by the tree line. His breath caught. He leaned closer, squinting into the darkness. The motion-activated lights didn't flicker on, but he could feel it. Someone was there. Grabbing a flashlight and a baseball bat, Derek headed outside, the rain pounding against his jacket. His pulse raced as he scanned the yard, his flashlight beam cutting through the sheets of rain. He called out, his voice trembling but loud. "I know you're out there. Come out now." Silence. Then, from somewhere near the garage, he heard it, a faint rustling sound. Derek turned sharply, his flashlight jerking toward the noise. His hands tightened around the bat as he moved closer. "Show yourself," he yelled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Derek saw a figure dart past the side of the house, too fast and too shadowed for him to make out any details. His heart pounded in his chest as he sprinted toward it, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Derek reached the side of the house, his breathing ragged. He shone the flashlight into every corner, expecting to find someone crouching in the shadows. Instead, he found something else, a small piece of paper soaked through from the rain, pinned to the side of the house. He pulled it free, his hands trembling as he unfolded it. The handwriting was unmistakable. The Watcher. "You're looking for me, Derek, but I'm closer than you think." A chill ran down his spine. Derek spun around, his eyes scanning the yard and the street beyond. It was empty. No cars, no people, just a relentless rain pounding against the pavement. Whoever had left the note had vanished into the night. The discovery of the note pushed Derek to his limit. He retreated inside, locking every door and window behind him, and collapsed onto the couch, clutching the note in his shaking hands. Maria found him there hours later, soaked and trembling, staring blankly at the floor. "Derek, what happened?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. He handed her the note without a word. Maria read it, her face growing pale. "We can't stay here anymore," she whispered. "This house, it's poisoning us. We have to leave." But Derek shook his head. "No, that's what they want. They want us gone. I'm not letting them win." Maria looked at him, tears in her eyes. "At what cost, Derek? What about the kids? What about us?" Her words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. For the first time, Derek realized how far he had fallen. His obsession with the Watcher had consumed him, driving a wedge between him and his family. Yet, even now, he couldn't let go. In a last-ditch effort to fight back, Derek reached out to the private investigator they had hired earlier, pleading for more resources to uncover the identity of the Watcher. The investigator, a grizzled man named Alan with decades of experience in solving cold cases, agreed to take another look. Together, they pored over every piece of evidence, the letters, the surveillance footage, the history of the house. Alan noticed something peculiar about the notes. Subtle references to local landmarks and events that only a long-time resident of the neighborhood would know. It narrowed the pool of suspects significantly. One neighbor in particular caught their attention, a reclusive older man who lived alone 2 houses down. He rarely spoke to anyone, and often kept his curtains drawn. But there were rumors that he had once been involved in a dispute over 657 Boulevard. Derek's pulse quickened at the possibility. Could this be the Watcher? But when Alan confronted the man, he denied everything, his demeanor calm and measured. Still, something about his answers didn't sit right with Derek. As the investigation dragged on, Derek began to doubt everything he thought he knew. Was the reclusive neighbor the mastermind behind the Watcher, or was he simply an eccentric scapegoat? Could the figure he had seen in the yard have been a random trespasser? Or was it part of a larger, more sinister plan? One thing was certain. The Watcher's game wasn't over. Each new discovery seemed to raise more questions than answers, drawing the broadest family deeper into the web of fear and paranoia that surrounded their home. Derek knew that if they were ever going to escape this nightmare, he had to find the truth. But the truth, he feared, might be far worse than anything he had imagined. And as the storm continued to rage outside, Derek sat by the window, watching and waiting, because somewhere out there, someone was watching him too. The broadest family's ordeal had reached its breaking point. The relentless fear and paranoia fostered by the Watcher had taken a toll on every aspect of their lives. Their once beautiful dream home had become a prison, and the family knew they couldn't stay any longer. But leaving wasn't as simple as walking away. It was a decision fraught with regret, financial loss, and unanswered questions. Maria sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling as she stared at the real estate listing for 657 Boulevard on her laptop. The words felt like an admission of defeat. For sale, a spacious family home in a quiet, desirable neighborhood. She glanced at Derek, who sat silently across from her, his face pale and drawn. "It's the only option left," she said softly. Derek nodded but said nothing. His gaze was fixed on the window, as if expecting to see a shadowy figure lurking in the yard again. For months, they had tried everything. Hiring investigators, questioning neighbors, even reaching out to the media. But the watcher remained elusive, their identity hidden behind a veil of anonymity. With no answers and no resolution, the family felt like they were abandoning the battlefield before the war was won. The hardest part was telling their children. The house, despite its dark aura, had been their home. Packing up their belongings and leaving their friends behind was devastating. Maria tried to frame it as a new adventure, but the kids weren't fooled. They knew something was wrong, even if they didn't fully understand what. News of the Broaddus family's decision to sell spread quickly through the neighborhood, reigniting speculation about the watcher. Some neighbors pitted the family, while others dismissed the letters as a hoax or a ploy for attention. The Woods family, the previous owners of 657 Boulevard, broke their silence during this time. They reiterated that they had received only one letter before selling the house and had dismissed it as a prank. But their reassurances rang hollow to the Broadduses, who had lived through months of torment. As the for sale sign went up in the yard, potential buyers trickled in, curious about the property's history but hesitant to commit. Maria felt a pang of guilt as she watched strangers tour the house, knowing she couldn't disclose the full extent of their experiences without scaring them away. Just as the family began preparing to leave, Derek received a call from Alan, the private investigator. "I've been digging into some of the neighbors," Alan said. "There's something you need to see." Derek met Alan at a nearby diner, where the investigator slid a thick folder across the table. Inside were detailed notes and photographs, all centered around one house, the home of an elderly couple who lived across the street. "They've lived here for decades," Alan explained, "but something doesn't add up. They've been receiving mail addressed to previous residents of 657 Boulevard, letters with no return address." Derek's pulse quickened as he flipped through the photos. Could this couple be connected to the watcher, or were they just another piece in the puzzle? As the days dwindled before the Broaddus family's move, one last letter arrived. It was addressed directly to Derek, its contents more chilling than any that had come before. "You've given up, haven't you? You're running away like the cowards you are. But 657 Boulevard will always belong to me. The house is alive and it knows you're leaving. You can't escape it. I will always be watching." The letter confirmed their worst fears. Leaving wouldn't bring closure. The watcher's presence would linger in their minds long after they had moved on. Derek felt a surge of anger and despair as he read the words, crumpling the letter in his fist. "I won't let them win," he muttered to himself. But even as he said it, he knew the fight was over. In the months following their departure, the Broaddus family struggled to rebuild their lives. They rented a smaller house in a different part of town, trying to find a semblance of normalcy. But the scars of their time at 657 Boulevard were hard to erase. The house sat on the market for years, its reputation as the Watcher House scaring off potential buyers. Stories about the mysterious letters and the family's ordeal became local legend, adding to the property's notoriety. Derek and Maria debated whether to go public with their story, hoping it might pressure law enforcement into reopening the case. But they also feared the backlash, accusations of fabrication, or worse, becoming the subject of morbid fascination. In the end, they chose to share their story anonymously, hoping it might serve as a warning to others. The media picked up the tale, turning the Watcher into an urban legend. Yet the case remained unsolved, and the Watcher's identity continued to elude both investigators and armchair detectives alike years later. Derek found himself driving past 657 Boulevard. The house looked the same as it had when they first fell in love with it, a charming, idyllic home on a quiet street. But to him, it was a monument to everything they had lost. As he sat in his car, staring at the house, he thought he saw movement in one of the upstairs windows. His heart skipped a beat, but when he looked closer, it was gone. Just a trick of the light, or so he told himself, driving away. Derek couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching him. And deep down, he knew that the story of the Watcher was far from over. This chilling conclusion leaves the story with an air of unresolved tension, reflecting the real-life mystery of 657 Boulevard. The unanswered questions linger, ensuring that the legend of the Watcher continues to haunt anyone who hears it.